Gilmore, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Sales for Warwick Forest. Today we're filming from the fitness center, and behind me you can see our pool. This is an indoor heated saltwater pool. It's about 90 degrees all year round, and there's also a hot tub tucked away in the back corner. Our residents enjoy water aerobics, relaxing, or just taking a little swim in the pool. We hope you're going to enjoy today's lecture. It's another very popular lecture that we have each year. Our speaker today is Dr. Bill Peach. Dr. Bill Peach was born in the old Riverside Hospital and has spent his entire non-academic life in Newport News. He received his BS degree in chemistry at the University of Richmond and his medical degree from the Medical College of Virginia, which is now VCU. He spent 2 years in general surgical training at MCV and then 4 years in neurosurgical residency, the last year as chief resident of the program. Dr. Peach became board certified and began his practice on the peninsula, where he had operating privileges at Riverside, Mary Immaculate, and Hampton General Hospitals. He was also a consulting neurosurgeon at Langley Air Force Base and the Veterans Administration Hospitals. While on the Riverside staff, he was at one time chief of surgery and later chief of the Riverside staff. Dr. Peach taught courses for the nursing school and MCV senior students. Following his retirement, after over 30 years of practice, he became associated with Lifelong Learning Society both as a student and later as a lecturer on various medical and surgical related topics. Dr. Peach also gave lectures to various civic groups. Although he has been designated fleet surgeon of the Hampton Yacht Club for 20 years, he is yet to operate on anyone injured on a sail or a power boat. Welcome, Dr. Peach. We hope you enjoy your lecture.
I'm Bill Peach. As you know, I'm retired, a retired neurosurgeon. And I was amazed that they asked me to take part in this program. And so they asked for a title, and I said, The Most Aged Brain. And the reason I said that was, when I sat back and thought about it, I believe that I'm the oldest lecturer that you will have this year. So that made me have the most aged brain. And what that did was allow me to use my experience with the changes that are taking place in my brain, particularly over the last couple of years, to inform you as to what you could expect and perhaps what you could do about it. And so this is this statement up here about how old do you think you would be if you didn't know the day you were born. I want you to keep in mind, because so often we think of chronological aging as being, how old are you? When were you born? And that really is not the way we should look at aging. We should look at it in a totally different way. I put this up because this is the one animal that I know can live forever. In other words, if you want to live forever, you have to be a hydra. Has no brain, digestive system is just one long tube. It just sits around on a rock, eating whatever drifts by, and unless it's eaten by a fish, it can literally live forever. The reason being, it has certain genes that it had inherited that allow that. It has certain enzymes that allow the genes not to be destroyed, etc. So if you want to be a hydra, that's fine, but I would rather live in another manner. Here is Jean Clément. She is, as far as we know, verified the person that's lived the longest, at least in modern times. She lived to be 122 years old. She was born in France. She took up fencing, by the way, when she was 90, and still riding a bicycle when she was 100 years old. She met Van Gogh, and in fact, she became, and still is, the oldest known actress when she appeared as a bit player in a movie about his life. Now, I wish I could say she did everything that I'm going to tell you you should or shouldn't do, but she still smoked a cigarillo every morning and had a little wine every morning. But whatever it was that she did right, including a prayer every morning, she lived to be 122. I'd like to, first of all, just for your own benefit, tell you about two different types of intelligence that people have. And this is particularly true because of what's happening today around the world, and particularly in Washington. At the bottom, you can have crystalline intelligence, and this refers to your ability to know things because you've acquired them through study and experience. In other words, you could be graduated from Harvard or Yale, and you would have perhaps a high crystalline intelligence. The problem is that there's another type called fluid intelligence, and you either have this or you don't have it. And it depends on you using logical thinking, particularly if you're doing multitasking and problem solving. And I'm convinced in my own mind that probably 40% of the people in Washington have crystalline intelligence because they keep telling us they graduated from Harvard, but they don't have just normal intelligence. They don't know how to do logical problem solving. That's just my opinion. And what happens, unfortunately, is that as we get older, your crystalline intelligence actually gets better. As we get older, we get smarter as far as crystallized intelligence is concerned. And if you took one of us and stacked us up against one of our grandchildren doing crossword puzzles, we'd probably beat them. But unfortunately, our fluid intelligence does tend to taper off so that we begin doing sort of dumb things as we get older. I'm not sure there's any way to correct that. So what happens? As we age, things begin going badly. We think in terms of the heart failing, the lung failing, et cetera, but actually the aging that we're going to talk about today, as far as the brain is concerned, starts at a cellular level. And the first thing that happens is that a part of the cells in our brain are unable to utilize oxygen and glucose well. The reason is because there's a decrease in a little speck within the cell called mitochondria. These mitochondria are what take the oxygen and glucose that we ingest and turns it into small packets of energy, like little batteries stored there. And this is an example of it. And these are the mitochondria. As the mitochondria release the energy, they also release other substances. Here again, the mitochondria within the cell. And when they release the energy, it's in the form of what we call adenosine triphosphate, which you don't have to remember. And that is a problem because as we get older, we get fewer mitochondria. And the problem is there are only a few ways that we know of that maybe we can increase the number of mitochondria. And I will go over that with you, but a secret is that it involves exercise. The second thing that happens is we get damage from what's called free oxygen radicals. And these are the exhausts that we get from the mitochondria when they're creating energy. These free radicals can cause damage to cell membranes, particularly in blood vessels. They can mess up your mitochondria themselves, so they actually can go back and hurt the very things that form them, and they can certainly cause damage with the DNA. Another example. So in addition to the mitochondria, as their exhaust causing these radicals, you can get the same problem with UV lights, atmospheric pollution, stress, and poor diet. Now, how do you do anything about that? Well, as you can see from this slide, we can try to protect ourselves with antioxidants. And we'll talk a little bit about how we get these antioxidants, but basically it's through a proper diet. I'll jump over this. This just shows you, I was going to show you how you get a free radical, but that's not, you don't need to remember that at all. The other thing that happens, the third thing, is the shortening of our, quote, telomeres. Now, I don't expect you to remember the name, but remember this, that at the end of each chromosome, and this is a chromosome, it's really it's wrapped on itself, it's composed of DNA, but at the ends, you have these little things stuck here, sort of like the tips of your shoelaces. The purpose of those is that every time we have a cell divide and this telomere divides, those get a little shorter. They're protecting it, but they tend, no matter what we do, to get a little shorter. And finally, a point is reached where they get so short. There's another example of this telomere on the tip. They get so short that they no longer can protect the chromosome, and so the chromosome is unable to reproduce. And at that point, we're having more cells destroyed than we are having them made. We call this senescence. And so what are we going to do about it? Well, we'd like to prevent the ends of the chromosomes from wearing off. And can we do that in any way? And the answer is there is an enzyme, but that's sort of dangerous to use for fear of creating a cancerous condition. But exercise has been shown to protect the telomeres. So you get the gist of what I'm going to say later on. And the other is this accumulation of cellular debris. Now, like everything else, as the processes go on in your cells and the rest of your body, in your brain, of course, you get debris formed. And as this accumulates within the brain, we fear that it causes some damage. Now, there are a number of different types. What you're looking at now is the so-called amyloid that we see a lot of talking about when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease. But this is beta amyloid. It's part of a normal protein that is broken off from the cell and then deteriorates. And it was thought, and still thought by some, that this is what causes Alzheimer's. Here's another example, I think. And you can see the beta amyloid and here the nerve cells, and they thought that these were toxic to the nerve cells. So for the last 4 or 5 or 6 years or longer, the whole treatment trying to prevent and treat Alzheimer's has been to see if you could get rid of this beta amyloid. And unfortunately, it appears that that's not working, that even where you can reduce the amount, it doesn't necessarily completely help you as far as avoiding degenerative brain disease. There's another problem that happens with cellular debris in your brain, and that's what we call breakdown of the microtubules. This interferes with the transmission of the nerve impulses from the nerve cells itself. So these are the two things. TAR protein, TAU protein, is what this consists of. And again, up until the present time, we've been measuring these two substances in the bloodstream and in the spinal fluid. But unfortunately, removal of these substances do not necessarily get rid of Alzheimer's disease. We'll go through this quickly, but I thought you ought to have a general feeling of what the nervous system looks like. So that's what a nerve looks like. Cell body, a charge is built up in here, electrical charge by a chemical reaction. There's a switch here. When the charge is large enough, that switch opens, an electrical impulse goes down the nerve. At the axon terminals, you'd think, well, maybe just a spark goes across to the next nerve like a spark plug. That isn't it at all. At this point, the electrical impulse stimulates the release of chemicals, and these go across the gap and attach to a dendrite on another nerve, and that sets off an electrical impulse. So this is really a chemical reaction here, and that chemical reaction is used to be modified to treat hypertension in some psychological diseases. There are other nerve cells. These are supportive cells, not nerve cells. The ependymal cells create spinal fluid. The oligodendrocytes put in insulation over the nerve. The astrocytes protect the blood vessels within the brain to keep toxins out, and the microglia go around cleaning up bacteria and debris. So all of these, we may have huge numbers of billions of nerve cells, but we have trillions of these type of cells. This is what the brain looks like. It's glistening because there's spinal fluid circulating under the very thin outer layer of the brain. The brain in the human probably weighs around 2.5 pounds. The area of the brain is probably about 2 square feet. Well, you say, my head doesn't look 2 square feet. Well, the problem is that as humans developed, and we got to a place where we had what was called Homo erectus, which was a human being that had all the appearances physically of a human, but a smaller brain. And then when his brain began to enlarge, and I'll discuss that in other lectures, it didn't have anywhere to go because it was encased in the skull, so it began enfolding on itself. And that's what you see here. These are called gyri, and these are sulci. And it's because the brain enfolded on itself, like you take a piece of paper and crush it up so you can put it in a trash can. That's what happened with the brain. This is the brain from the side, still glistening. It looks like a sort of a big walnut. Each area of the brain, we have lobes, and the lobes are named for the portions of the skull that are above them, but you've got a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, an occipital lobe, and a temporal lobe. Down here, you have the cerebellum, which has to do with your balance and coordination and some sensation. And way down here, you have the brainstem, which has the vital functions such as respiration, heartbeat, digestion, etc. Each area of the brain has its own function. This is for vision, for feeling, for motor function, for thinking, for hearing. Each one has its own particular area of expertise, but they're all connected. I put this in here this is very confusing, but all it tells you is that if you're looking at the brain from the front, the leg is in the midline, and then as you go across the top of your head, these are representations of what the nerves do. So if you had a stroke here, it would involve your face. That's on the lateral aspect of your head. If you had it up here, it would involve your hand. Notice that the more delicate things that you have to do have the greater number of nerve spaces allowed to it over the brain. And this is what it looks like on the inside. These are connections between the various areas of the brain. You also have this one that goes across. It's interesting that even though the male brain may be slightly larger, it doesn't necessarily have more nerve cells than the female brain, and it doesn't have as many crossover connections. As you get older, here's a 28-year-old brain. As you get older, things happen. When you get into my age group, you'll see that the sulci get larger and the gyri get smaller. And this is particularly noted here. There's the normal temporal lobe, there's an 88-year-old temporal lobe, and then in the very frontal part of the brain, there tends to be some shriveling up. And this is normal. This is a normal part of aging. That doesn't necessarily correlate with your behavior or your knowledge. What we've done here is inject a dye into the brain and to see how it's functioning. The darker the color, the more active the brain cells in that area. This is normal. Somebody that has what we call mild cognitive impairment. You see a little bit of lessening over here in the temporal and parietal areas. That has to do with memory, but the rest of the brain is fine. So maybe after you're 70, you're going to have about 30% of the people of the population are going to have mild cognitive impairment, but that doesn't mean they can't live a normal functioning life. Alzheimer's, it gets pretty bad though. You can see the temporal lobes where you have memory are getting not much function, all the frontal lobes. Now, I put this in here because with all that complicated stuff, I came up with the female brain, and you can look at this just briefly, but as you see, a lot is devoted to getting headaches for various, so you can make various excuses. Shoes is a big factor. Driving skills, you can hardly see down here. Anyway, I showed this to my wife and she got upset. So to be fair, I brought up the male brain, and the male brain seems to be dominated. This is a middle-aged male brain with the object of sex. And the frontal area, you're thinking about it, and here you're doing it. This changes as you get older, and actually this area disappears completely. And but notice that the ironing skills are barely seen. The domestic skills are barely seen. The ability to listen to your wife is barely seen. When this is empty, we call it a box, and men tend to sit there and just stare into nothingness, and we say that they're in their box. Here are the types of memory. We're going to talk a lot about your memory, and there's so many different types of memory. Your sensory memory is what you see or hear very quick, less than a second. If you're driving down the road to Williamsburg, you're seeing things on the side of the road that you don't even remember because it's a flick of a memory through your eyes or ears, and it's gone. Unless you happen to see a giraffe over there, you would remember that. Short-term memory is what we have to deal with. This is memory usually less than a minute, but it's a type of memory that you could utilize when you were shopping, say, where you have to compare things. You get, is 2 of these at $8.50 better than 3 of these, at $11. So you got to remember something, then transfer it to the next aisle and pick that back up. Working memory is a big problem as we age because we begin to have problems with that. Long-term memory is really divided into a couple of things. One is implicit memory, and this means that it's just there. You don't think about it. It's also called procedural memory. So this means, for instance, if you knit, you don't think about that. You sit there and knit. If you're riding a bicycle, you don't really think about that. You know how to ride a bicycle, and it's all done in an unconscious procedural type of manner. Whereas explicit memory means it's a conscious memory that you have to work at. And you can have two different types. Semantic memory is for facts and concepts, and like, where is the Suez Canal located, or how much is 5 + 6, et cetera, et cetera. These are facts, and these stick with you your whole life. It's concepts, it's not a personal thing. Whereas episodic memory are things that you remember that you are associated with. So if you went on a vacation and you remember what you did during that vacation, that's an episodic memory for events. Now, the problem with having episodic memory experiences is that we lose that as we get older. So unless you have photographs or videos or something, you are gradually going to lose the ability to remember a lot of your life's events. And not only in the past, but in the recent times. So this is where you have problems with names. You are associated with someone, you've known them all your life practically, and all of a sudden you meet them face to face and you cannot remember their name. Is there something we can do about that? Well, there's some training perhaps that we can talk about to work with that, but that is a normal process of aging. We're going to lose some of that episodic memory. So if we want to remember, where do we have to look at? Well, this is the brain. Deep within the brain are these structures called the hippocampal gyri. That's Greek, hippo and campus, and it means sea dragon or seahorse. And this is the area where we do a major remembering. This is another example of it here and here. This location, if you were to point directly back from your eye and directly in from the front of your ear canal, that's about where you would hit it right there, the hippocampal gyrus. And if you want to remember it, just think of somebody going across the campus of CNU riding a hippopotamus. This is why they name it the seahorse. This was dissected free from the temporal lobe. This is the hippocampal gyrus, and you can see now how it got its name by the ancient people. So it has to do with short-term, converting short-term to long-term memory, very important. And also, it's also used to find out where we are, to navigate in our daily activities. If you have a problem with the hippocampus, which is where most of us will have it, you're going to have trouble converting short-term to long-term memories, and you may tend to get lost in areas that you've only visited once or twice and haven't really established it well in your hippocampal gyrus. The other area, as far as our memory is concerned, is the very front of the brain. This is the most recently formed from a phylogenetic standpoint, the prefrontal cortex. And this is the area, as you can see, where you have empathy, insight, emotional regulation, where you can work out problems, etc. It's connected to an area which we won't discuss now called the limbic system, and that has to do with your emotions, particularly your primitive emotions. So what do we lose? This is all of us, and as I say, I can see it in my own existence. And you know, you can get upset about it, but the problem is it's going to happen. So processing speed, how fast can you solve problems? How quickly can you delve into something and try to come up with the answer, or do a puzzle, or anything that involves processing speeds through your nervous system. And that's going to go slowly, but it goes. The time it takes to do a mental task. Now, this has nothing to do with how intelligent you are. You can sit there and have problems doing crossword puzzles or Sudoku, et cetera, et cetera. It has nothing to do with your innate intelligence, but your processing speed does slow down, and you're trying to do multiple tasks is going to really get screwed up. The other is episodic memory. We mentioned that. That's memory for things that have happened in the past, biographical events, et cetera, that took place in your life. You have to be associated with it. But unfortunately, that type of memory will gradually fade away. And executive function, and this is how well you can work out problems, how well you can designate jobs to various people about you, how you can figure things out that you haven't ever gone through before. It's executive function, reasoning, problem solving, etc. This is going to go too as we age. You're going to have more and more trouble figuring things out, like me going from a very ancient operating system to Windows 10, and it is still driving me totally crazy. I got a book on Windows 10. I got a book on Windows 10 for seniors. I got a book for Windows 10 for idiots. And then I'm trying to find a book that describes how to understand the other books that I bought. Now, what can we do? We have all these problems, and I've looked at this and over the last 2 or 3 years for my own reasons. And I'm going to go over with you briefly what I came up with as the best solution. Now, I've read the books, and they're all over the place. It's all over the internet. Everybody that writes them says they're a doctor and that they're an expert. And all I can say is that it takes a lot of reading and going over the details of what they say to come up with what probably is the best way we have to try to delay a deterioration in their mental function. The first, and I put these in the order of importance is for what I have found in my reading. Physical and mental exercise are at the top of the list. When we talked about the mitochondria, there are very few things that will improve mitochondria, and physical exercise is one of them. There are very few things that will help your help delay the deterioration of the tips of the chromosomes, and physical exercise is one of them. So I stress that. We're going to then talk about the proper diet, proper sleep, perhaps some socialization and moderate managing stress. We'll do as much as we can in the time that's allowed. Now, physical exercise is the most important. And the studies now show that with the proper type of physical exercise, the proper amount of physical exercise, that you can shorten or even halt some of the loss of cognitive function. Benign cognitive impairment, for instance, has been shown to have been arrested, and in some types even reversed a little bit. What we're trying to do is to keep all we've got. If something should happen where we begin to develop some type of degenerative disease, we'd like to slow it as much as possible. And that's why physical exercise is necessary. Now, the point is this: for it to be beneficial, based on all the studies that I've read, it has to be aerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise means that you're using up fairly vast amounts of oxygen and initially glucose and later fat. And we know that aerobic exercise will increase brain volume. They've had numerous studies that actually show increases in brain volume following people that have done the proper exercise programs over a period of time. And it does not only help form new nerve cells, which we used to think couldn't happen, but it also improves the connections between the nerve cells. And it does this by stimulating a biochemical change in the brain One of these is BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And what this chemical does is that it helps what we call stem cells, that's undifferentiated cells sitting at the base of the brain, particularly around the hippocampal gyrus. It helps them to turn into nerve cells. And when I started lecturing to nurses 35 years ago, I used to say, you have all the nerve cells you're ever going to have, and you can't get any more. Well, we know that isn't true, that you can build new brain cells, particularly in the area of the hippocampal gyrus, which is where we're talking about as far as our memory functions. And there are other chemicals there that also can be increased. And we have the two here. I won't go into great detail of that, but one of the big factors is that it helps the blood flow to the brain and keeps the brain functioning properly that way. And these are things I've already talked about. The Mayo Clinic had come out some time ago and said that regardless, of your age, that they had found the only thing that they felt slowed down the progression of Alzheimer's disease was aerobic exercise. Now, it's interesting. I used to experiment on myself all the time while I was trying to figure out what I could do to keep my brain functioning properly. And what I do, among other things, is I do a Sudoku or two in the morning and a crossword puzzle in the morning. And over a period of a year, I noticed that I was better at Sudoku if I did it in the morning after I took the dog for a walk than if I did it in the afternoon. So I said, that's interesting. So I started doing all my Sudoku and crossword puzzles in the morning. And I actually found that I could even get up and sometimes do even a 4 or 5 star Sudoku, which to me was the ultimate. I picked up this from one of my readings, and what it is it shows the top of 2 kids' heads. And what they did was they were going to give these are pre-adolescents, they were going to give them a sort of an IQ, brain functioning test. And they divided it into 2 groups as equally as they could. And with one group, they just had them sit quietly, and the other group, they had exercise with a 20-minute walk. And then they had them take the test. Well, it turns out that the majority of the time, the kids that had done the 20-minute walk performed the test better. So then they just switched. They switched groups, and the same thing happened. If you did a 20-minute walk, you perform the test better. So now we have ways of looking at the brain functioning, heating up as it would, and this is what you see. They took these, this is probably an fMRI scan, but they took these studies and it actually shows you that the brain starts functioning better when you're walking. You're doing a physical exercise and all of a sudden your brain is lighting up. And this led most of the investigators to come up with the conclusion that you want to work your brain better, you got to work your body better. Now, you say, well, I get out and I wander through the garden and this and that and the other. Well, I hate to tell you this, but you can't just amble around and think you're going to get these results. It has to be work. And I wish I could say that it was pleasant all the time. I use my dog as an excuse, but if you can find a pleasant aerobic exercise, and one way of doing it is when you go for a walk with friends, or do something you really enjoy. Some people enjoy swimming and enjoy cycling, and all of these things can get to be aerobic. Now, to be aerobic, your pulse has to get up, your breathing has to get up. One gross way of looking at it is that if you're doing aerobic walking, you can talk to the person next to you, but you can't sing. You just doing too much to sing. The more scientific way is this formula 220 minus your age. These numbers behind that, if you multiply it by 0.65, it's probably moderate. If you get up to 0.85, it's pretty stressful. So in this case, if you're 75, you would want your pulse rate at the end of your walk to be about 116 beats a minute. In addition to that, you should be breathing a little hard. This is should be done. I try to do it all at one time, but sometimes you do it in segments. If you just can't do 30 minutes of it, well, do 15 minutes in the morning and do 15 minutes in the early evening. Housework or yard work will count as long as you're carrying it out vigorously. People say, well, rather than walking and cycling, I work out with weights. Well, it is possible. Most of the literature doesn't consider that aerobic, but from personal experience, both in both classes that C and U give, I know that you can get up to an aerobic level if you do it properly. This involves you have to use more weight than you probably want to use, but you should use, and you have to do it with enough repetitions and without taking rest periods in between. And so I found that I can do that. Even in Betty's class, which is strength and stretch, if you use more weight, more repetitions, you can get your heart rate up to an aerobic level. Now, yoga, Tai Chi, balancing, they're really not aerobic. They contribute to your health, but I wouldn't say that you could count that as your aerobic activity. Okay, so what I'm saying is you need to exercise. The best, easiest exercise is to probably walk, and the amount that the experts say that you should get of the aerobic exercise is 150 minutes a week. The more you get, the better. The higher the aerobic level, the better. But you should strive to try to get your 150 minutes a week. And so I've laid out some walking paths for me and my border collie. And we try to get in 30 minutes 5 times a week, or 20 minutes, 25 minutes 7 times a week. As far as mental exercise is concerned, the reason for that is we now know that the brain is constantly rewiring itself. Not only can we make new nerve cells, but the cells that are there can be rewired. It's called neuroplasticity. And it's the fact that all through our life, the brain is continually losing neurons, gaining neurons. It's losing synapses between cells, and it's gaining synapses. So what do we want to do? We've exercised our brain indirectly with physical exercise, but how about the mental exercise? Well, it's very important because we know that you can build new neurons. They had an experiment years ago before they had GPS with the taxi drivers in London. The taxi drivers in London had to have a 2-year apprenticeship before they can be given a license, because apparently the streets up there are amazingly complicated. They get MRIs of their brain before they started the 2-year program and afterwards. And lo and behold, their hippocampal gyrus, gyri, had increased in size significantly just from their training period. So you can increase the size of your brain, at least the number of the neurons in specific areas, by brain exercises. And what that means is that then as you get older and you begin to lose a little bit of it, you've got something to fall back on. You've got extra stuff in the background that will help you. Now, to do this, it sounds simple, but it's not quite that simple. You have to challenge the brain. And challenging the brain is not reading a adventure story or a love novel, et cetera, at bedtime. That's fine to do, and it relaxes you and it's good, but pleasure reading does not really challenge your brain. It has to be trying to acquire new skills and knowledge. So there are some things that I can suggest that you do and that lifelong learning fortunately has available for you, but it has to challenge your brain. By the way, just going to a lecture or listening to a lecture at lifelong learning is not going to really challenge your brain a great deal. You do it and you hear what they have to say and it's pleasure and you enjoy your surroundings. But I'll guarantee you, if you go to a lecture at lifelong learning and you don't take notes and you don't have a good handout, you are going to forget 60% of what you heard within the first 4 or 5 days, another 20 or 30% in the next week. And so by the time you come back to the next lecture, maybe you thought you remember 20 or 25%. So the question is, either take good notes, go home and read them, wait 4 or 5 days, read them again, and then before you come back for the next lecture, read them again, or if you get good handouts, do the same thing. But just attending a lecture by itself is not going to offer a real challenge. So I've said my piece on that. Oops. Now, how else can we do it? Well, the electronic technology, video games, et cetera, that's a new field. At this point, there's no one video game that's going to strengthen your brain all over. Some things help a little, increase your reaction time or decrease your reaction time, et cetera. And a lot of the doctors that are dealing with neuroscience are trying to get on this by forming little groups to develop video games. But at this point, there are very few in circulation, and these are usually in clinics that you could say truly increase the neurons in the brain. So you're going to challenge your brain repeatedly. How are you going to do this at lifelong learning? Well, a new language. If there's anything that challenges your brain and forces you to do homework and learn, it's a new language. Now, well, are you really going to go to Germany or France or Spain? It's not necessary. You do it not because you're going to go anyplace, but because it's one way for sure that will challenge your brain and increase neurons in the brain. What's another? Learning to play a musical instrument. Fortunately, lifelong learning started up with the ukuleles, which was a great idea. I think that the same thing could be done with the piano, if you could figure out all the problems associated with piano playing in lifelong learning. But what I'm going to do, Jane's going to love this. What I'm going to do is take one member of lifelong learning and see if I can teach that person. I think I've already picked her out, how to play the piano so that she could play popular tunes within 5 weeks. I think this is possible because it's I did it myself, and I won't go into that. But there's a way to learn to play the piano. It's not the classical method that takes years, that allows you to begin to play popular tunes in a relatively short period of time. And I'll let you know how that works out. The other thing is bridge. I don't know. I don't play bridge. Some of the people I know seem to talk more than they play bridge, but I'm going to call up some people in lifelong learning that play a lot of bridge and try to get a good feel for how much exercise of the brain that involves. Upper level chess certainly would be another factor. Do you have problems where something comes to the tip of your tongue, it's just there and you can't get it out? Well, that's happening more and more to me. And part of it is called blocking. In other words, you're trying to remember something and other stuff interferes with you remembering it. And this is a sign of aging and forgetfulness. I wish I could give you the total way of handling that. The way I handle it and the way the experts say to handle it is that you have to try to relate what you're trying to remember to something, some common event or occurrence or a picture. Actually, visualization of things is the one way to remember. If you can visualize something, you tend to remember it better. For instance, I'll give you a for instance. I kept having problems remembering the name of a very good friend who had helped me with legal problems before, and it just wouldn't come to me. I've known him for years and years and years, talked to him maybe every 2 months or so, and then all of a sudden I want to call him and I cannot remember his name. So what I did was I said, okay, this is the way I'm gonna remember it. This fellow always comes to me to save me from problems. So I keep thinking of the Lone Ranger riding a white horse to help me out. And sure enough, I can remember the name now. It's White, Miller White. So every time I want to remember this attorney, I think of somebody coming to help me on a white horse. This is silly, but believe it or not, it works. So association is the indispensable key. If you can associate something with a vision, this is good for remembering people's names, but that helps a lot. I put this number up here. I just flash it up here. And so look at that number. I pull this right out of the hat. And now how many of you can remember that number? Well, in our age group, you shouldn't be able to remember the whole number. If you were 20 years old, you probably could. When you get up to 30, the numbers, the digits that you can remember drops to about 6 or 7. And when you get up to 70 or 80, it probably is going to drop lower than that. So how would I remember that? If I were going to remember that, the 804 is easy because there are only 2 area codes around here, and 804 is one of them. So you just say 804 and you forget that. You know what it is. Then you come out to 85 to 90. And I would say, well, 85 to 90 is when your brain really goes to pot. And then I would look at 241. When I was 24, we had our first child. So you can do things like that, and it actually works. So the next time somebody gives you a phone number on the phone, you don't have a pencil, try associating it with something rather than trying to remember each individual decimal point. Now, here's the way I challenge my brain for what it's worth. That's the square root of 2. And I decided maybe 3 years or so ago in one of the classes that I was going to see how far out I could take the square root of 2 using association. That's 50 decimal points. And I can give you the square root of 2 to 50 decimal points now. And I'm trying to work on another 10, and hopefully at some point you try to get it up to 100. But it can be done, and it's done by association. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing. That's from here in. Everybody knows that's the square root of 2. 1356 is the Battle of Poitiers. You associate with something you already know. That's the 100 Years' War. 2373, when I was 23, I was 73 inches tall. 09540 is part of the telephone number. 1688 is when, to see history would be when Prince William and Murray. I came over back from Holland to assume the throne, 72-42. When I was 72, I was 72 inches tall when I was 42. I mean, you see what I'm saying? You can do things like that. You associate it in groups of 4. And as I say, I've got it up to 60, well, this is 50 to 60. Am I bragging? Yes, but the point is that I need to go higher, and that's one way to keep stressing your brain, stressing your brain. Okay, let's get to the diet real quickly. Exercise is the first thing. Everybody that I've talked to and read say that if you want to improve your brain, physical exercise at an aerobic level is the best way to do it, period. If you want to stress the brain physically, mentally, everybody that I've read says, first thing they say is learn a foreign language even though you're never going to use it. The second thing would be learn to play a musical instrument. So these are things that I'd like to leave with you as far as that's concerned. As far as the diet is concerned, the old thing, what's good for your heart is good for your brain. There are all kinds of diets. They really should be called eating plans. And the latest thing is actually the MIND diet, M-I-N-D diet, which is sort of a hodgepodge of the Mediterranean diet and the diet for hypertension, et cetera. But you can look it up on your computer, and that's the latest rage as far as what's good for your brain. This is just one of the statistics I came across. Okay, now, what did I find over the last 2 years that I should eat if I wanted to help my brain? Number one is fish. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is your brain, let's face it, is about 60% water and it's about 20% or more fat. And the primary fat is the omega-3. And unfortunately, your body doesn't make that very effectively. So what you want to do is get a food that is known to increase that brain-derived neurotrophic factor that's known to help solidify the connections between the nerves and the coverings of the nerves. And fish is the best. And what is the best type of fish? Well, I looked those up, and these are the ones I'm going to give you. The first is wild Alaska salmon. Wild is important rather than farm raised. Alaska happens to be a cold water area. There are others, sardines and mackerel. You can pick others, but I picked salmon because you can get that in a slow smoked or a cool smoked variety, and just leave it in the refrigerator and use it as snacks if you want to. So I eat a lot of fish. The minimum should be once a week. The ideal should be 2 or 3 times a week. Walnuts. I have a whole big bottle of walnuts that is kept in the kitchen constantly, and every morning I grab a handful and eat. Now, it's a lot of calories, so you don't want to eat too many walnuts, but if you can have them every day, that's great. It's another way of getting antioxidants and omega-3. In addition, this one study I saw showed that there was a 19% lower risk of cardiovascular disease. What's good for your heart's good for your brain. I didn't mention it to you, but here we've got a brain that weighs 2 or 3% of your total body weight, and the brain uses 20% of the energy that your body produces, 20%. So you've got to maintain a good heart and a good circulation to maintain a decent brain. Blueberries. I looked up all the berries, and it came up the top of the list of blueberries. You can have other colorful berries if you wish, and right next to it was strawberries, and then some blackberries. But I keep blueberry, my wife keeps it. We keep blueberries in the refrigerator constantly, and I try to eat them 3 times a week with a type of cereal. You can, you know, how often you eat, the people that give all the information, I'll say once or twice a week. It's just part of my eating plan to eat them more often than that. Kale. This is a part of it, of every diet, the Mediterranean diet and the Mayan diet, etc., is kale, because it's a leafy green vegetable and it has all of this good stuff in it, which helps as an antioxidant. It helps try to prevent progression of macular degeneration and reduce inflammation, etc. Now, the problem is I hate kale. I've hated kale since I was a kid. There are other things you can have as well, of course, collard greens and spinach. But my wife became aware of, I said, you know, kale is this great thing, but I hate kale. So she fixed some type of kale that I've never experienced in my entire life that actually tasted good. So maybe you can talk to Betty, or if I can get the recipe, but I eat kale now a lot and it tastes very good. I actually look forward to it. Okay. But anyway, green leafy vegetables, that's great as far as the brain is concerned and longevity, I might add. Coffee and tea. Thank goodness you can get coffee and tea. Actually, it's good for you. Now, which is better, coffee or tea? I'm not going to get into that argument. They both have health benefits. I have never drunk a full cup of coffee in my entire life, but I drink gallons of tea, so it's whatever you prefer. The experts say it would be good to have 3 to 4 cups of coffee a day. However, you shouldn't be drinking it after 3 o'clock for reasons that I will tell you in just a moment. But they have good antioxidant properties. And you can see why I drink tea, but that's just, I don't say that you have to drink that over coffee. Both are fine. I have not found that any supplements do you much good unless you have a deficiency in it. In other words, taking a supplement to boost your vitamin C when you've already got normal levels, or D, or E, or whatever, has not found to be helpful. If your doctor has demonstrated that you are deficient in a specific vitamin, and the big thing now is deficiency in vitamin D, which we get as we get older, then that would be justified. All of these things that supposedly enhance memory, you've noticed that they've had to tone down the ads somewhat because the FDA has found no evidence that, in spite of what they say on TV, that they really do you that much good. It's probably more placebo effect. Now, the other factor, we've had exercise, we've had diet. The next factor people don't realize is sleep. And this is extremely, extremely important, and we're getting less and less of it. The average American today gets 2 hours less sleep than their grandparents did. And it's not good. And the reason is because you still need 7, this is what the experts say, you still need 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Now, the idea that as you get older, you need less has been disproven over and over again. The reason they picked 7 to 9 hours is not that you can't get by with less. You certainly can and still live a half decent life. But if you want to optimize your brain function, if you want to optimize the function, you need to get 7 to 9 hours. And you can't make it up at the end of the week. These factors go on every single night. So you aim for 7 to 9 hours of good sleep. The fact you're in bed, not asleep, doesn't count. You need deep sleep, and I'll show you why. It's because it's during sleep that we take all the information we gathered during the day and store it in permanent memory. We do that in the deepest stages of sleep, and we call it delta wave sleep. And unfortunately, we get less delta wave sleep as we get older as well. The other factors is innovative ideas, and that comes with REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is a shallow level of sleep. But these are when you begin to have ideas and suddenly wake up in the middle of the night and think of something, or an answer to something that you've been worried about. And a lot of the people that write or publish books or write music get some of these ideas in this REM sleep. Now, if that wasn't enough, we know now that during deep sleep, this is delta wave sleep, the brain relaxes, spinal fluid, cerebral spinal fluid flushes through the brain and actually removes the debris that was there. So every night, if you can get into deep sleep, you have this cleansing effect on your brain, which hopefully would decrease the chances of you developing degenerative brain disease. This is just to show you stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you go through these stages. Maybe I have a picture here. Yeah, here we go. Okay, you go to sleep, and this is what happens. Gradually, you can still be, you're not even totally asleep here. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And finally, you get down at stage 4, delta wave sleep. You stay there a little while, maybe an hour, hour and 45 minutes, you come back up. And here's where you get rapid eye movement sleep. It's a very light stage of sleep. Your brain is very active. It's rapid eye movement because the only thing that's working are your muscles of respiration and your eyes. Otherwise, in that stage of sleep, you are totally paralyzed. And if you should suddenly be awakened in that stage, you may actually, in some few people, be paralyzed, not permanently, but for a second or two, all of a sudden, you're suddenly awake and you can't move or do anything. You've been awakened from REM sleep. That's just one way to do that. These are the ways, when you look at it on an EEG, electroencephalogram, beta is 13 to 30. This is active when you're active. Alpha is when you are relaxed but awake. Theta is a moderate deep sleep, and then delta wave sleep is the deepest sleep. Well, we have problems. As we age, it takes longer to fall asleep, and we sleep less, and we're waking up more, and we're going to the bathroom, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're tired in the morning. And I went through all of this, and then my wife suddenly one day, 2 years ago, said, when you're asleep, you stop breathing. Like everybody does that, I said, well, how long do I stop breathing, dear? And she said, oh, sometimes 45 seconds or so. I said, 45 seconds, I stop breathing completely? Oh yeah, how often do I do this? You do it a lot. I knew exactly what it was. I had sleep apnea. I didn't know I had it. And of course, so I go to a sleep specialist, and your choices there are several as to how to handle it. In my case, when I got the sleep study, it discovered that if I was on my side, I didn't have sleep apnea. So what I did was rig up something so that I couldn't get on my back when I was asleep, rather than get the CPAP machine. But the CPAP machine is great if you've got sleep apnea. Here are things that you can do. You've got to keep the same schedule every day. That's a good way to get good sleep. Use the bed only for sleep and sex. In my case, as you get older, I had to put in reading as well. Limit the time you stay in bed. You should be in bed when you're sleepy. Avoid caffeine after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. No alcohol 2 hours before bedtime, and of course, limit your fluids. These things we use at home. We've got sound absorbing stuff all over the place. I use earplugs, we use white noise, and we've kicked the pets out of the bedroom, all because I am convinced how important it is that we get a good night's sleep every night, if at all possible. Sleeping medications, I would say to avoid these, except for extreme short-term use. They do not give you normal sleep. They sedate you, and yes, you're asleep, but you do not get all the benefits of a normal sleep using sleep medication. The only exception to that probably would be some of the normal medicines that are available. But I wouldn't use anything for sleep if you can avoid it. Okay. I've covered as much as I can. There will be a series of lectures in the second semester, 5 series of lectures, when we'll go over much of this again, but in greater detail, and with a lot of other stuff added in, particularly why we're having so much trouble now with diabetes and heart disease and cancer that are related to things that happened millions of years ago. So with that, I'm going to show you my favorite Doonesbury, if you're familiar with Doonesbury. This is the uncle and his nephew. That's my feeling about not using your brain and having to substitute electronic devices to take the place of good thinking. Okay. We'll see if we're trying to handle, as far as questions, they may be coming into the office and we may try to type out and send out some replies if they're specific questions.
What causes short-term memory loss issues as we age?
Short term, that's because we're the hippocampal gyrus is just getting a little smaller. You know, it's normal, it's aging. We are losing more connections than we're making. And that's why we're doing all of this, to try to stop the short-term memory loss. It's perfectly normal. If you have short-term memory loss, that's a normal part of the aging brain. And it's because we're getting some decrease in the size of the hippocampal gyrus.
How does heat and humidity in the summer affect the brain, and how should we deal with it?
I really don't know the answer to that question, because I have the same problem with heat and humidity. I'm not sure that it has a direct effect on the brain. But it's a good question. It's just that I don't have the answer to it. I've never even investigated that as a possibility. I know that the one thing may be is that as we get older, our system for cooling the body deteriorates, so that we're not able to adjust to extremes of temperature because of other parts of our body not functioning properly, losing heat through the skin, et cetera, et cetera. So other than the fatigue and so forth, you would get through that, but it would be an indirect thing. I don't think the heat and humidity directly affect the brain, but I think it certainly affects the body. And that in turn may aggravate things.
How do blood pressure medications affect aerobic levels?
Blood pressure medications kind of screw up how you decide when you're at an aerobic level, because some of the blood pressure medicines, your pulse would not speed up, for instance, with some of them. And so you'd have to use, rather than your pulse rate, you'd have to use those other factors that I mentioned, which basically are getting out of breath, how fast you breathe, and can you sing, can you talk but not sing? Because with blood pressure medications, the pulse rate is not as efficient a method of measuring aerobic level. I'd go by how out of breath you get.
What is the nutritional difference between Alaska wild-caught salmon and other salmon?
Well, this is just what I read. It's that the salmon that's farm raised apparently do not get all of the nutrients that the salmon that are wild and that are allowed to grow up, if you will, in colder environments. You want a cold water fish, and the areas where they raise them in farms, you can't get that difference in temperature. That's my understanding. But it's just all the advice that you get by the people that are supposed to know, say, use wild and use cold water. Those seems to be the two, when you're selecting the fish, the two that you'd want. And be sure you can find out those that don't seem to imbibe mercury to any great degree.
What do you think of melatonin to aid in sleep?
I think melatonin is the one. Melatonin is a natural. Melatonin is a natural hormone put out by the pineal gland. And I should have mentioned that, I would not object to the use of melatonin to help sleep. Now, here's the problem. All the studies are screwed up. And the reason is because there's no federal guidelines as to how much melatonin is in the pill. It may say 5 milligrams, it could be 50% less or 100% more. So my advice to using melatonin, which by the way I use, is that to use a small amount. If you start using, and by small, I mean no more than 2 milligrams. If you use more than 2 milligrams, the tendency is for the melatonin receptors to become resistant to it. It's like too much insulin blocks the receptors, for insulin. So if you're going to use melatonin, my advice is, one, use it start an hour before bedtime. Secondly, I would not exceed 2 milligrams. Thirdly, the type that I use actually is a somewhat expensive, not really expensive, but it's a capsule that some is released immediately and the other is released slowly over the nighttime. So I think it's called Sleep Ease, but yes, I use melatonin, but I would not use more than 2 milligrams. You're not going to die or anything, but it's probably going to begin to lose its effectiveness as your body adapts to it. So keep it 2 milligrams or less. Now, if you wake up, you take 1 milligram, you wake up at 3 or 4 o'clock, you can take another 1 milligram if you want to. But I would limit it to 2 milligrams. And it's perfectly safe as far as I'm concerned.